Donas Douglas. I'm stepdaughter to the late Dr. Neville Clare, MA PhD, and daughter of Mrs. Marveline Clare. This is part 2 of chapter 1, entitled 1964 Crisis, from Dr. Neville Clare's book, An Oscar for My Troubles. One of the other rooms in the house was occupied by my older stepsister, Mr. Stewart's daughter, Curleen. The larger upstairs bedroom was also rented to relatives at first. My cousin Lowell and her husband, Mr. Williams, and their young son, Danny, from her first marriage. After a while, they moved on to buy their first house in Hornsey, and another young couple came. A young guy of about 23 and his wife. I vividly remembered those tenants. The man in particular, I wish I could remember his name, because I certainly got to like him. Again, I was in the living room. I heard some kind of altercation in the hallway, raised voices, Mr. Stewart's and this young tenant's. Though he was nearly 40 and the young guy a fit strapping fellow, Mr. Stewart was making the threats and thought he could back them up. "Nobody can mess with me in this house." He was like that, a fearless type of character, and people had to stay clear of him. Or that was his perception. He thought he could beat any man who was out there. But on this occasion, after a few seconds of shouting, I heard loud bumps against the wall and the floor. I went to look, and there was Mr. Stewart flat out. I was filled with quiet elation at the sight. Once or twice after that, the young tenant took me out for the evening, and I talked to him about Mr. Stewart. "He's such a difficult man." "Well," he said, "if he comes near me again, I'll do the same." One day, he was coming through the house. The tenant did hear Mr. Stewart having a go at my mum this time. He flung open the door and confronted him. "Don't you dare treat her like that." He banged with his fist on, of all things, the big radiogram, the one item that Mr. Stewart treasured like all West Indian men of that time. Mr. Stewart's violence was mostly verbal. It was bluster and boasting. He never hit me, for example. It's true that I'd always treated him with politeness and respect, not because I actually did respect him, and certainly not because I was afraid of him, but out of respect for myself. He and my mum did have fights, and I believe he hit her sometimes. He would not hesitate to hit a woman, the same as a man. I have one memory from Haringey Road of my mum hitting him with a bottle, which I think was probably self-defence after he'd hit her. The police came that time and said it was usually, in those days, "Sorry, we can't do anything, it's a civil matter." It was only the young tenant who really gave him his comeuppance. Mr. Stewart actually became afraid of him. I noted the signs with satisfaction. He'd always dictated what had went on in his house, but now a tenant was dictating to him what he could and could not do. This man could say anything to him. He could not react from fear of getting the same medicine as before. He was humbled. I did like that young man. He was a nice guy. Notwithstanding my mum's hopes of finding someone to look after me, the city was a place where I would soon be effectively on my own. It was daunting. As yet I had no way of making a living, and moreover I had always been shy, a bit introverted. Still, I was looking forward to it, to my state of independence, which was almost in my grasp, but not quite. We were living our last months together in Haringey Road. I was going to college each day. I had left school with no qualifications, and now I was trying to get some, studying for O-levels and also learning general draftsmanship by correspondence course. Expectations were very low for black children leaving school. Apart from those recruited as nurses and transport workers, our parents are all doing factory jobs or similar work. That's what they had been brought over to do after the war, and there was an assumption that those were the jobs black people would always be doing. But even at school, I had known that I would never be able to do regular manual work. I was never going to be fit enough. The doctors had never found any cause for my spells of pains and weakness, but I had them all my life. My schooling had been interrupted by illness. It was just accepted that was the way I was, delicate. Just as people believed anything the doctor said in those days and never asked questions, they also did not think to argue much if the doctor had no answers. I accepted the way I was, At the same time, I'd never felt that I was so different from everyone else. Whenever I could, I joined in with what my friends did. I would simply have to get by in an adult world by any means possible. Mathematics and technical drawing were things I was best at. I had hoped somehow to get a job doing it, or some other kind of office work, even though it's practically unheard of for a black boy to do such a thing. My first attempts to ask for work in various offices had been met with a blank wall of rejection. I was not thinking about being a pioneer, but only of survival. There were enough challenges to face in my immediate future, it seemed, but as I sat at home and physical pain quickly grew and overwhelmed me, I was about to face another. For me, the word crisis would eventually come to have a special meaning. If you'd asked me then what it had meant, I would perhaps have said it was something to do with the Russians and Americans and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I came round on the ward. I'd been given a general anaesthetic and operated on. They had carried out a laparotomy, exploratory surgery, to try and find out what was wrong. It was logical enough given my symptoms, and given that I was actually wrong with me was not understood or suspected by a single one of the medical staff present. Even a simple operation could have killed me. As it happened, general anaesthesia works by altering the chemical makeup of blood, in a particular way its ability to oxygenate the organs of the body, including the brain. It is the hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells that perform this oxygenating function. At the best of times, it takes precise skill and care to carry out anaesthesia safely. Then surgery involves tissue damage and disrupts the blood circulation. Any patient's survival and recovery depends on the blood behaving in various protective ways to compensate for this and to repair the damage. If the patient's blood is affected by an undetected hemoglobin disorder, surgery carries enormous risks. I am still here because I was lucky on that occasion and not for the first time. I remained in hospital for another 2 weeks or so. They gave me pain-killing drugs. I did not know which. They gave me some oxygen by mask and intravenous fluids. Slowly, I got better. I do not remember a doctor even talking to me while I was there. Possibly at 17 I was deemed too young to receive any information, or possibly it is a reflection of the way all patients were kept in greater ignorance then. My mum and I gathered that the surgery had found nothing obviously abnormal in my abdominal organs. I had been sewn back together, a sample of blood taken to be tested, and that was it. I had all the standard blood tests many times before, never with any result. I was not told of the result of this new test. I wanted to get back to my studies, to my life. There was no radio or music in the wards in those days, but I associate the hospital stay with two records that were popular, that I really liked. They were playing in my head a lot, so to speak. Dionne Warwick's Walk On By and Millie Small's My Boy Lollipop. My condition slowly improved to the point where I was sent home, still with no explanation for what had happened, nor with any follow-up or advice. I wanted to forget it naturally, that I was getting better. It was certainly not my instinct to worry or brood about it. I wanted to pick up again and get on with my life and return to technical college. Most importantly, catch up with my work. My mum must have thought about things a bit harder and wanted to have someone to leave in charge of me. She had accepted that I would not go with them to Jamaica, but as an adult she must have been more concerned about how I was going to get by than I seemed to be, and the knowledge that I had a debilitating physical condition, even if she did not understand what, nagged at her all the more after the recent frightening drama at the hospital. The idea about me living with her sister kept coming up, but there was always problems, especially from my side. My aunt lived too far away in South London. Her home already included 4 children, Beverly, George, Martha and Yvonne. Living with her and her husband in a 2-roomed flat. I did not want to exchange my current situation for one that might have had as many problems through different ones. The date for my mum's departure with Mr. Stewart in June was suddenly close, and still from her point of view nothing was sorted out about my care. It was at that point, just after I came home from hospital, from what I now know to call my first serious crisis, that we heard from my dad. He had decided to come to England himself, and that he would have me live with him and look after me for the few years he planned to stay. And that was how we settled. In June I had my 18th birthday. My mum and Mr. Stewart